Today, I want to talk about something that is far more difficult than getting rich. I want to talk about how to stop being poor. Those are not the same problem. Becoming wealthy is a long-term game of capital allocation. Escaping poverty is a short-term battle against fragility. Most people believe poverty is simply a lack of money. I don't see it that way. Poverty is a system. It is a loop where income creates pressure. Pressure creates short-term decisions. Short-term decisions prevent asset building, and the absence of assets keeps income low. And once you are inside that loop, it becomes very difficult to think clearly. When I was young, I observed something simple. People who were under constant financial stress did not lack intelligence. They lacked breathing room, and without breathing room, you cannot make long-term decisions. Elon Musk once described problems in terms of physics. He said that if you want to change an outcome, you have to understand the underlying system. I think that applies here. In physics, a rocket must reach escape velocity to leave the Earth's gravitational pull. If it reaches 99% of that speed, it doesn't almost make it. It falls back. The early stage requires the most fuel because gravity is strongest near the ground. That is what low income feels like. You work hard, you save a little, you make some progress, and then something happens. The car breaks down, the rent increases, a medical bill arrives. Because you never built enough buffer, you fall back to where you started, sometimes lower. This isn't about laziness, it's about mathematics. When you live without assets, every shock is amplified. When you live with assets, shocks are absorbed. That difference changes everything. Financial stress also narrows your thinking. When you're worried about next week's bills, you don't think about 5 years from now. You think about Friday. And when your time horizon shrinks, so do your decisions. That is the poverty loop. Low income leads to stress. Stress leads to poor decisions. Poor decisions prevent asset accumulation. And without assets, income remains fragile. Round and round. When Elon built his early companies, he reinvested nearly everything back into systems that created leverage. I took a different path. I focused on building a margin of safety first. Different personalities, but the same underlying principle. You must change the structure before the outcome changes. In this discussion, we're not going to talk about luxury. We're not going to talk about becoming a billionaire. We're going to examine the mechanisms that keep people stuck. The scarcity tax, the emotional spending trap, the limits of linear income, the influence of your social environment, and the power of compounding, working for you instead of against you. If you understand the mechanics, you stop blaming yourself, and you start building differently. Because poverty is not a verdict, it's a system. And systems can be redesigned. Let's begin with the first mechanism that keeps people inside the poverty loop. I call it the scarcity tax. Most people think that if you simply give someone money, the problem disappears. Sometimes that helps in the short term, but if the structure remains unchanged, the loop resumes. There was a study conducted by researchers at Harvard and Princeton that found something uncomfortable. When a person is under financial stress, when they are worried about rent, debt, or unexpected expenses, their effective cognitive capacity drops, not permanently, but measurably. The equivalent of losing around 10 to 13 IQ points. That is not an insult. It is biology. When your brain is occupied by urgent survival concerns, it reallocates bandwidth. Long-term planning is deprioritized. Strategic thinking narrows. You become focused on immediacy. If you're worried about keeping the lights on, you're not evaluating 10-year asset allocation models. You're solving for Friday. This is why poverty perpetuates itself. It taxes not only your bank account, but your processor. Early in my investing career, I was less concerned with maximizing returns than I was with preserving mental clarity. Liquidity is not just a financial asset, it is a psychological one. When you have cash reserves, your decision-making improves because you are not cornered. Elon experienced a different version of this. During Tesla's early years, the company came dangerously close to insolvency more than once. In those moments, decision-making became compressed. Every payroll cycle felt existential. That is not an environment where optimal thinking thrives. It is survival mode. Survival mode is expensive. There is also a mathematical dimension to the scarcity tax. You may have heard of what's sometimes called the boots theory. A wealthy person buys a durable pair of boots for $100 that lasts 10 years. A poorer person, unable to spend $100 at once, buys $25 boots that last 1 year. Over a decade, the second person spends $250 and endures discomfort the entire time. The same principle applies to everything. Bulk purchasing, insurance, preventative health care, reliable transportation, education. The inability to invest upfront increases long-term cost. When you lack capital, you pay a premium for fragility. Late fees, overdraft fees, high-interest debt, subprime lending. Each one is a penalty for instability. And once those penalties begin compounding, the math becomes unforgiving. This is why the first objective is not wealth. It is insulation. Before investing, before speculation, before entrepreneurship. Insulation. A modest buffer, even $500 or $1,000, begins to reverse the scarcity tax. It converts emergencies into inconveniences. It prevents high-interest debt from entering the equation. Most importantly, it restores cognitive bandwidth. When you are no longer panicking, you can think. When you can think, you can plan. And when you can plan, you can begin building assets instead of extinguishing fires. People often skip this step because it feels small. It does not look impressive. No one celebrates a $1,000 emergency fund, but I have found that small structural shifts produce disproportionate psychological change. When you stop living at the edge of catastrophe, your time horizon expands. You begin to evaluate decisions, not just by relief, but by durability. That shift from reaction to intention is the first real escape velocity. Elon built buffers differently. Instead of preserving personal comfort, he reinvested into systems that could generate exponential returns. I preserved capital for opportunity and margin of safety. Different approaches, same principle. Reduce fragility first. Until you reduce fragility, growth is unstable, and unstable growth collapses. The scarcity tax is the first loop because it is the most invisible. It doesn't feel like a tax. It feels like life. But once you see it, you realize something important. Poverty is not only about income, it is about volatility without protection. Break that, and the loop weakens. Now we move to something even more subtle and more emotional. The second loop, the one that doesn't attack your bank account first. It attacks your reward system. The second loop is not mathematical, it is emotional. When people are under financial pressure for long enough, something subtle begins to happen. The stress does not simply stay in the background, it demands relief. Biologically, when you are anxious or under prolonged strain, your cortisol levels remain elevated. Cortisol is useful in short bursts. It prepares you to act. But over time, it exhausts you. Your brain begins searching for balance. It begins searching for a reward. And this is where the dopamine trap begins. From the outside, it is easy to judge spending behavior. People will say, if someone is struggling financially, why are they buying new phones? Why are they eating out? Why are they purchasing branded clothes? But most consumption in low-income environments is not indulgence. It is relief. When you purchase something new, your brain releases dopamine. For a brief period, you feel control. You feel progress. You feel visible. The problem is not the purchase itself. The problem is that the relief is temporary. The bill is not. Over time, this becomes a cycle. Stress creates the need for relief. Relief creates spending. Spending increases financial fragility. Fragility increases stress, and the loop tightens. One of the most underrated traits in investing is temperament. I have often said that investing is not a game where the highest IQ wins. It is a game where the most stable temperament wins. Temperament means the ability to delay gratification. It means resisting the urge to convert capital into applause. Even after I had accumulated more than enough to change my lifestyle dramatically, I chose not to. Not because I lacked desire, but because I understood something simple. Consumption compounds backward. Assets compound forward. Elon demonstrated a more extreme version of this principle. At one point, despite being one of the wealthiest individuals in the world on paper, he sold multiple properties and simplified his personal life. That decision wasn't about aesthetics. It was about focus, about removing distractions, about reallocating energy toward mission and leverage instead of lifestyle. When you're inside the poverty loop, consumption often becomes identity repair. It is a way of signaling to yourself and others that you are not failing, but signaling does not generate cash flow. Assets do. This is where a mental reframing becomes necessary. When you receive $500, there are two ways to evaluate it. The first way is to ask, what can this buy? The second way is to ask, what can this build? And the first question generates dopamine. The second generates leverage. Most people never consciously choose between the two. They react. Breaking this loop requires something uncomfortable, temporary austerity, what some people now call monk mode. Not permanently, not as punishment, as recalibration. When you remove optional spending for a defined period, cancel subscriptions, reduce discretionary purchases, cook at home, eliminate impulse buys, something interesting happens. Your reward system begins to adjust. You begin to experience satisfaction not from spending, but from accumulation. Watching your savings grow begins to produce its own reinforcement. That is a different form of dopamine. It is slower, quieter, but it compounds. The key distinction between those who remain stuck and those who break free is not income alone, it is reward structure. If your brain is conditioned to seek immediate relief, you'll sacrifice long-term leverage for short-term comfort repeatedly. If your brain is conditioned to value progress over applause, the trajectory changes. Temperament is not glamorous. It does not produce dramatic moments, but it is a structural advantage. When you're no longer emotionally compelled to spend in order to feel stable, the system loses one of its strongest control mechanisms. You begin to separate desire from direction. You begin to see money not as anesthesia, but as fuel. And that is when real momentum becomes possible. The third loop is less emotional, but equally dangerous. It is the illusion that more hours will solve a structural ceiling, and that illusion keeps people exhausted for decades. The third loop is the one that keeps people permanently tired. It is built on a simple equation most of us were taught early in life. Time equals money. If you want more money, you work more hours. You take overtime. You get a second job. You drive on weekends. You say yes to every extra shift. That equation sounds logical. It is also incomplete. Time is finite. You have 24 hours in a day, and a portion of that must be spent sleeping. If your income is directly tied to hours worked, your earnings are mathematically capped. There's a ceiling you cannot break through, no matter how disciplined you are. Meanwhile, your expenses are not capped. Inflation does not care how many hours you work this week. Rent increases whether you are exhausted or not. Groceries rise in price whether you have energy left or not. In economics, wages are what we call sticky. They move slowly. Prices do not. So if inflation rises at 6% or 8%, but your salary rises at 2% or 3%, you are losing purchasing power, even if your paycheck is technically higher. You feel like you are running uphill because you are. In investing, we are always looking for compounding mechanisms, structures that allow returns to grow faster than inputs. Sailing time is not compounding, it is linear. Linear systems are predictable, and predictable systems have limits. Early in my career, I made a deliberate decision not to build my income around wages. I did not want my earning potential to be bound by hours. Instead, I focused on ownership. When you own a business, even a small part of one, your income is tied to the output of the enterprise, not the hours you personally contribute. That is a structural difference. Elon approached this differently, but arrived at the same principle. He did not attempt to earn more by working more shifts. He built systems, companies that could scale. A single rocket launch or a single software platform could generate revenue far beyond the hours required to build it. This is the distinction between labor and leverage. Labor sells time. Leverage sells value at scale. Most people trapped in low income are operating in a labor-only framework. They are replaceable. If they stop showing up, income stops. That is not security. That is fragility disguised as stability. The market does not reward effort. It rewards scarcity and scale. If you can be replaced easily, your income will reflect that. If your output does not scale beyond your direct input, your income will remain linear. Breaking this loop requires a shift in how you evaluate your own work. Instead of asking, "How many hours can I add?" you ask, "How can I increase the value of each hour?" That might mean acquiring a complementary skill. It might mean moving from execution to coordination. It might mean transitioning from being the worker to being the contractor. It might mean building something once that can be sold repeatedly. The form is less important than the principle. You must detach income from time. This is where many people misunderstand wealth-building advice. They believe the wealthy simply work harder. In reality, the wealthy often work strategically at first, building assets that later work independently of them. I did not earn my returns by increasing my personal working hours. I earned them by allocating capital into businesses that produced earnings without requiring my daily presence. Musk did not increase his wealth by driving the same number of hours as everyone else. He built systems that multiply the impact of each decision. If you remain trapped in the equation of time equals money, you will eventually encounter the ceiling. And ceilings do not respond to effort. They respond to redesign. The escape from this loop does not happen overnight. It begins with recognizing that selling more hours is not a permanent solution. It begins with investing in capabilities and positions that increase leverage. Because if you remain linear in a world that compounds, you will always feel behind. And that is not a motivation problem. It is a structural one. Next, we move deeper into that structural shift, into how you transform from being replaceable to being rare. The fourth loop is subtle. It doesn't feel like a trap at first. In fact, it often feels responsible. It is the belief that if you become very good at one thing, the market will reward you proportionally. Sometimes it does, often it doesn't. The modern labor market does not reward effort alone. It rewards scarcity. And scarcity is rarely created by mastering a single crowded skill. If you're excellent at something that thousands of others can also do competently, your income will eventually reflect supply, not effort. This is the rarity problem. When I began investing, I did not try to become the smartest economist in the world. I did not try to predict macroeconomic cycles. I focused on something narrower, understanding businesses that were simple, durable, and within my circle of competence. Then I applied patience and discipline more consistently than most. It wasn't brilliance, it was positioning. Over time, temperament combined with capital allocation became rare, and rarity commands value. Elon Musk built rarity differently. He was not the world's best pure physicist. He was not the world's best software engineer. But he combined first principles physics thinking with engineering execution and an unusually high tolerance for risk. That combination was rare. Physics plus manufacturing plus scale ambition is not common. The market pays for combinations that are difficult to replicate. Most people remain stuck in low income, not because they lack ability, but because they remain interchangeable. If your role can be replaced in a week by someone equally qualified, your income will stay constrained. Interchangeability suppresses leverage. The way out is not to become the best in the world at one thing. That is an extraordinarily high bar. The way out is to become difficult to substitute. This is what some call skill stacking. If you are moderately good at communication and moderately good at finance, you are more valuable than someone who is excellent at one and incapable at the other. If you understand operations and also understand sales, you're no longer just a worker, you are a multiplier. Multipliers command higher compensation because they increase the output of others. In investing, we look for businesses with moats, structural advantages that protect profitability from competition. On a personal level, your skill stack becomes your moat. If your income depends solely on one narrow, easily replicated function, you have no moat. And without a moat, pressure erodes margins. This is where many people miscalculate their efforts. They work harder at the same task, hoping that intensity alone will increase income. But if the task itself is widely available, intensity merely increases fatigue. You must expand capability in a way that increases strategic value. That may mean learning to sell if you are technical. It may mean learning finance if you are creative. It may mean understanding systems if you are operational. Elon repeatedly immersed himself in areas outside his initial training: rockets, battery chemistry, manufacturing constraints, not because it was comfortable, but because understanding the entire system increased his control over outcomes. Control increases leverage. When you move from being a component to understanding the architecture, your earning ceiling rises. There's also a psychological shift here. When you are rare, you negotiate differently. When you are replaceable, you accept terms. When you are valuable, you discuss terms. This is not arrogance, it is structure. Escaping low income requires increasing your structural value to the market, not by exaggerating credentials, but by expanding capability. The market does not pay you based on how hard your day felt. It pays you based on how hard you are to substitute. Once you understand that, your focus changes. You stop measuring progress by hours worked and start measuring it by leverage gained. That is the beginning of moving from labor to advantage. But even rare individuals can remain trapped if they are surrounded by gravity. Which brings us to the next loop, the environment. The fifth loop is often the most uncomfortable to discuss because it has less to do with money and more to do with people. Human beings are not isolated decision-making machines. We are social creatures. We absorb expectations, language, habits, and limits from the environments we inhabit. And over time, those environments shape what we consider normal. Normal is powerful. If everyone around you believes that being financially strained is inevitable, you begin to treat it as inevitable. If everyone around you complains about the economy but never studies capital allocation, you internalize complaint as strategy. This is not about intelligence. It is about exposure. There's a phrase often repeated: you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. That statement is not mathematically precise, but it is directionally true. Behavior is contagious. In investing, I have always tried to associate with people who think independently and act rationally. My long partnership with Charlie Munger was not accidental. We reinforced each other's discipline. We challenged poor reasoning. We elevated standards. Environment compounds. Elon built something similar in a different way. When constructing SpaceX and Tesla, he did not hire average performers and hope they became exceptional. He assembled teams that were already operating at extreme levels of competence. High standards became cultural gravity. Culture determines ceiling. If you are attempting to escape low income while surrounded by individuals who have accepted it as permanent, you are working against social gravity. There's a concept sometimes illustrated with crabs in a bucket. If one crab tries to climb out, the others pull it back down, not out of malice, but instinct. When you change your behavior, reduce spending, study investing, acquire new skills, people close to you may not applaud. They may question. They may mock. They may insist that the system is rigged and that effort is pointless. It is easier for them if you remain consistent with their worldview. Escaping poverty often requires behavioral divergence. That divergence can feel isolating, but isolation is sometimes necessary for reprogramming. This does not mean abandoning friends or family. It means protecting input. If your daily conversations are saturated with pessimism, that narrative becomes your mental soundtrack. You cannot build ambition on a foundation of resignation. Fortunately, environment is no longer purely geographic. We live in an era where exposure to high-level thinking is accessible. When you read biographies of disciplined capital allocators, when you listen to long-form discussions about business strategy, When you study shareholder letters instead of social media arguments, you are adjusting your reference points. Reference points determine expectation. Expectation determines behavior. And behavior compounds. When I was younger, I spent an extraordinary amount of time reading annual reports and studying investors who operated differently from the crowd. That intellectual environment shaped my own decision-making far more than social approval did. Elon immersed himself in physics textbooks, engineering manuals, and discussions with domain experts. His mental peer group was defined by problem solvers, not commentators. You become what you repeatedly observe. If your environment rewards consumption, you will consume. If your environment rewards learning, you'll learn. If your environment rewards ownership, you'll seek ownership. Escaping social gravity does not require hostility. It requires intention. It may mean reducing exposure to unproductive narratives. It may mean spending evenings building skills instead of reinforcing complaints. The objective is simple. Shift the average upward. When your environment normalizes asset building instead of paycheck survival, your behavior adjusts accordingly. You do not need everyone around you to change. You need enough influence to outweigh the drag. Once social gravity weakens, structural change accelerates, and that prepares you for the final loop, the mathematical divider between those who remain in the cycle and those who exit it permanently. Compounding. There's a line in economics that divides two very different lives. On one side are the people who pay compound interest. On the other side are the people who earn it. That line is often invisible at first. It does not announce itself. It does not feel dramatic. But over 10 or 20 years, it creates a separation so wide that it looks like luck, when in reality it is mathematics. When I was young, I became fascinated with the idea that money could reproduce, not through labor, but through allocation. If $1 could generate 10 cents, and that 10 cents could generate 1 more cent, and so on, the curve would eventually steepen in ways that felt almost unfair. But compounding does not care about fairness. It cares about direction. If you're carrying credit card debt at 20% interest, compounding works against you every single day, even when you sleep, even when you behave responsibly, even when you do nothing wrong. That is the cruel symmetry of compound mathematics. Elon understood this dynamic from a systems perspective. In engineering, small inefficiencies, repeated thousands of times, destroy performance. Likewise, small improvements, compounded across iterations, create breakthrough outcomes. The principle is identical in personal finance. If you're paying interest, you're running uphill. If you're earning interest, the hill eventually tilts in your favor. Most people trapped in low income are not failing because they lack ambition. They are failing because they are positioned on the wrong side of compounding. They have car loans, credit balances, consumer debt, subscriptions, small drains that seem manageable individually, but collectively create reverse momentum. Reverse momentum feels like exhaustion. You wake up, go to work, make responsible choices, and yet the numbers barely move. That is not laziness. That is physics. The first stage of escape is not investment. It is elimination. And high-interest debt must be neutralized because it is mathematically stronger than most realistic investment returns. There is no stock portfolio that consistently outruns 20% compounding against you. When Elon faced near bankruptcy during Tesla's early days, he did not ignore cash flow pressure. He obsessed over burn rate, because burn rate is the business equivalent of high-interest debt. If you cannot slow it, you cannot survive long enough to scale. Stage 1 is survival. Stage 2 is positioning. Once the bleeding stops, the direction must reverse. Even small, consistent allocations into productive assets begin shifting the slope. An index fund, ownership in a business, real estate that generates cash flow. These are not glamorous at first. They are seeds. Most people underestimate the psychological difficulty of watching a small portfolio grow slowly. It feels insignificant. It feels too small to matter. But compounding requires patience at the bottom of the curve. In my own life, the majority of my net worth was accumulated after decades of steady reinvestment. Not because I suddenly became smarter, but because time amplified consistency. Elon's companies demonstrate the same pattern. Early years looked chaotic. Progress was fragile. But once the slope turned positive, once reusability reduced rocket cost, once battery production scaled, momentum accelerated. The market rewards those who survive long enough for compounding to steepen. That is the divider. Those who remain consumers of credit stay beneath gravity. Those who become owners of productive assets gradually reduce dependency on labor alone. The final stage is freedom. Freedom is not yachts and spectacle. Freedom is when your assets generate enough to cover basic survival. At that moment, the equation changes. You are no longer required to sell every hour of your time to remain stable. That is escape velocity. It does not require billions. It requires crossing the compound divider, from paying interest to earning it. Once that shift occurs, progress becomes structural instead of fragile, and that prepares us for the final integration, and understanding how all these loops connect, and how the door has been open longer than most people realize. Now step back. If you look at all the loops together, scarcity, dopamine, linear income, skill rarity, social gravity, and compounding, you begin to see something uncomfortable. The system was never primarily about money. It was about structure. Low income is not just a paycheck problem. It is a systems problem. And systems do not change with motivation. They change with redesign. When I study businesses, I don't ask, how can this company try harder? I ask, how is it structured? If incentives are misaligned, if costs exceed durable revenue, if competitive advantage is weak, no amount of effort will fix it. The same is true in personal finance. You cannot outwork structural fragility. You cannot hustle your way out of poor positioning indefinitely. You must redesign the system you are operating inside. Let's connect the pieces. Scarcity tax reduces cognitive bandwidth. When you are financially stressed, your mental processor slows. You make reactive decisions. That feeds the dopamine trap, spending for relief instead of strategy. Dopamine-driven consumption increases liabilities. Liabilities intensify linear income pressure. You work more hours. Fatigue increases. Learning slows. Skill stacking stalls. Without skill stacking, you remain interchangeable. Without rarity, income ceilings remain low. Low ceilings reinforce social gravity. You remain surrounded by people who normalize stagnation. And without structural change, you stay on the wrong side of compounding. It is one closed loop, but the opposite loop also exists. Buffer reduces stress. Reduced stress increases clarity. Clarity improves decisions. Good decisions lower liabilities. Lower liabilities increase savings capacity. Savings build assets. Assets generate optionality. Optionality increases confidence. Confidence allows risk-taking and skill expansion. Rarity increases income. Higher income accelerates asset acquisition. Assets begin compounding. Compounding creates freedom. It is also a loop. You are always inside one of these systems. The difference is direction. When I invested in companies like Coca-Cola or American Express, I wasn't betting on quarterly headlines. I was betting on systems that generated consistent cash flows over long periods. Durable systems win. Elon did not build Tesla to win 1 year. He built it to alter cost curves permanently. Structural shifts create durable advantage. Escaping low income requires thinking the same way. Stop asking, how do I make more money this month? Start asking, what system am I inside, and is it compounding against me or for me? That is a different question. It is less emotional. It is more surgical. Most people try to fight symptoms. They attack expenses randomly. They chase income spikes. They react to emergencies. But unless the underlying structure shifts, the loop resets. Structure determines outcome. You must intentionally build a personal economic model that reduces volatility, increases leverage, compounds assets, and aligns environment with growth. That does not happen overnight. It happens through a sequence. First, stability. Second, discipline. Third, capability expansion. Fourth, asset acquisition. Fifth, patience. Notice what is absent from that sequence. Glamour. There are no dramatic hacks, no lottery jumps, no overnight breakthroughs. Elon's public image often emphasizes dramatic launches, but internally his companies are defined by iterative engineering, thousands of small refinements. Buffett's public persona emphasizes wealth, but internally his life is routine, repetition, reading and waiting. Progress looks slow until it doesn't. Most people quit at the flat part of the curve. They mistake early difficulty for impossibility. But physics has a consistent rule. Once escape velocity is achieved, resistance drops dramatically. The launch is violent, orbit is silent. Low income feels loud. Bills, stress, social pressure, fatigue. Financial stability feels quiet. You wake up without panic. You make decisions without desperation. You invest without urgency. That quiet is not boring. It is powerful, and it is achievable, not through hope, but through structural redesign. The door is not locked. It is simply heavy. Which brings us to the final message, the countdown, and the choice. Let me leave you with something simple. The door was never locked. It was heavy. There's a difference. Most people look at poverty and see injustice, unfairness, bad luck. And sometimes those things are real. The world is not evenly distributed. Starting points are different. Opportunities are uneven. But systems still obey structure. Gravity exists for everyone. Rockets built in wealthy nations still require escape velocity. The physics do not discriminate. The same is true here. You are not trapped because you are incapable. You are trapped because the structure around you, and sometimes inside you, is compounding in the wrong direction. And compounding does not care about effort. It cares about alignment. If your money flows toward liabilities, it compounds against you. If your time flows toward low-value repetition, your income compounds slowly. If your environment reinforces limitation, your ambition compounds downward. If your stress remains constant, your cognition compounds weaker. But if you shift even one of those loops, the direction changes, not instantly, but permanently. When I was young, I was not thinking about billions. I was thinking about not going backward, about avoiding permanent loss, about preserving optionality. I lived in the same modest house for decades because I did not want lifestyle to dictate decisions. Elon did not build companies to look impressive. He built them to control outcomes. He reinvested aggressively because he understood something critical. Ownership creates leverage. Different personalities. Same principle. Control direction. Low income is not defeated by motivation. It is defeated by redesign. You redesign your expenses first. Eliminate fragility. You redesign your habits. Remove dopamine leaks. You redesign your skill set. Increase rarity. You redesign your environment. Increase expectation. You redesign your balance sheet. Move from paying interest to earning it. That is the sequence. It is not glamorous. It is not viral. But it works. At first, you will not feel rich. You will feel disciplined. Then you will feel stable. Then you will feel less afraid. And one day, quietly, you will notice something has changed. The emergencies no longer derail you. The bills no longer terrify you. Your assets begin to generate small, steady returns. Your decisions feel deliberate instead of desperate. That is orbit, not yachts, not headlines. Orbit. From orbit, you can choose your next trajectory. That is wealth. Not the number in your account, but the absence of panic in your decisions. If you are still at the launch pad, understand this: the early phase consumes the most fuel. It feels violent. It feels unfair. It feels exhausting. That is normal. Every rocket shakes before it clears the atmosphere. But rockets do not escape by wishing. They escape by exceeding threshold. Your threshold is structural, a buffer, no high-interest debt, growing skills, asset accumulation, a new environment. Once those conditions align, the mathematics begins to work for you. And when mathematics works for you, effort multiplies instead of cancels out. The working class often believes that hard work is the answer. Hard work is necessary. But structure determines whether that work compounds or evaporates. You do not need to be extraordinary. You need to be consistent in the right direction long enough for physics to shift. That is all. The door is open. It has always been open. Most people just stop pushing before it moves. If you found value in this, stay with us. This channel is not about hype. It is about alignment. Not about shortcuts, but about structural advantage. And in the comments, I want you to write one thing. Not your income, not your ambition, but the loop you are currently fighting. Scarcity, dopamine, linear income, skill ceiling, social gravity, or compounding against you. Because clarity is the first redesign. And once you see the system, you can finally start building your own.